Hey everybody, my name is Ross, and today we're going to be looking at apartheid in South Africa and specifically how the Dutch Reformed Church was influential in making that come about and their culpability in all of that. For those of you unfamiliar with apartheid, it was the political policy in South Africa from 1948 through 1994 of separate development, they said. So the races were specifically divided from each other so that they could develop separately, was the presupposition, but really it was just enforcing cultural differences and reinforcing economic disparities. So what I found was that the Dutch Reformed Church was really one of the driving forces behind making it happen and providing the model for it. So let me read my thesis for you. I seek to illustrate how the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa played a leading role in the development and implementation of apartheid by establishing a racial pattern for South Africa and developing its own apartheid theology, which would provide biblical justification for the government's policy of division from 1948 to 1994. So let's get started. We got to go way back to 1652 to understand how this all played out. In 1652, Dutch Reformed colonists settled at Cape Town, led by Jan van Riebeeck. And this culture, they were completely mired in the slave trade. And with that, it influenced how they went about missions. Missions, according to those first Dutch Reformed colonists, was done by white people to black people. So it was very paternalistic, and it was very mired in the slave trade in that culture. So over the next 200 years, that continues to play out with this paternalistic model, but also a lot of racial divisions were cropping up, and there became a lot of questions about should the black natives and should the white Dutch Reformed people, should they worship together? And in 1829, the Dutch Reformed Church's General Synod said, yes, they should, but then they made an amendment to it in 1857. This amendment said that it is ideal for them to, but playing off of the verse that says, it's in Romans 14, let me look at my notes real quick. Romans 14, verse 21, they said, if the weakness of some says that it is detrimental to the gospel, if the weakness of some makes it detrimental to the spreading of the gospel, then it's okay to worship separately. So the precedent was set back in 1857, and in 1881 they established the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, which is an entirely separate denomination for the black congregants of the Dutch Reformed Church. So moving forward, a couple more historical things. The Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902 took place, which resulted in a lot of poverty for the Dutch Reformed people. And because of this, they start developing this nationalism. They called themselves the Afrikaners, and they really believed themselves to be a people ordained by God for South Africa. So that was a messed up theology. It was a theology rooted in nationalism. But from that nationalism that sprouted up is really where they started developing this policy of apartheid to advantage themselves over and above their black neighbors. So going into 1948, apartheid is implemented officially with the core assumption that the races should be able to develop separately to their fullest potential, separated from one another. And we'll get into how that theologically developed. But politically, it developed in model after the Dutch Reformed Church and Dutch Reformed Mission Church. The Dutch Reformed Mission Church was established as its own denomination, but it was under the parental guidance, basically, of the Dutch Reformed Church. So it was its own church, but really, it couldn't govern itself. It was at the whim and it was the whim and it was the subject of the Dutch Reformed Church's whims. Um, so that was a messed up way for a church to develop, but that really modeled what apartheid would become. It provided the model for what would happen. So I just want to get out there in the open. Apartheid was not a political system that inspired a heretical theology. It was a heretical theology that inspired a political system. So let me explain how that happened. First, we got to look at Abraham Kuyper, who was around in the beginning of the 20th century, and he had three core doctrines that he advocated for that really influenced things. First was he viewed Calvinism as a life system, and those civilizations that most accepted Calvinism would be those that would experience the most social and cultural development. The reason being that if you are Calvinistic, you believe that you are under the sovereignty of God, therefore you are allowing God to guide your civilization rather than your own self, therefore you will develop more fully. Then he also comes up with the concept of sphere sovereignty. Sphere sovereignty was the idea that there are various spheres in the world, like there's the economic sphere, the family sphere, the arts sphere, all those kinds of things, and they should not infringe on each other. They should be sovereign over their own domain and under the sovereign care of God. And then the third one was common grace. Common grace was the assumption that, in Reformed theology, we affirm total depravity. And common grace was the assertion that, yes, we are totally depraved, but there is a common grace God gives to all people so that we do not fall completely under our total depravity. Then moving on, another important theological development was Gustav Warneck's Volk missiology. Volk is German for people, and this missiology said that people, it is not individual people that should be the subject of mission. It is people groups, entire nations should be encountered with the gospel and transformed. So from these concepts, we get the development of apartheid theology, and this is how it goes. So first, going back to Abraham Kuyper, there's the assumption that if you're Calvinistic, your society should be further developed. So therefore, the Dutch Reformed people, they assumed that they were more culturally, socially developed than their black neighbors. Then they took the concept of sphere sovereignty and coupled it with Gustav Warneck's Volk missiology and said that the Volk themselves should be considered a sphere and they should not infringe upon each other. So therefore, the Dutch Reformed people are a Volk. They should not mix blood or commingle with their black neighbors. And then the third one, there was an assumption that God had given a greater amount of common grace to the Dutch Reformed people than their black neighbors, and the Dutch Reformed people were responsible for guiding their black neighbors further along in their social and cultural development. So that's the assumption of the theological development. And those took place in the 1940s, those theological developments, and then apartheid would then be implemented as a political policy in 1948, showing that really the Dutch Reformed Church played a driving force in providing the justification for apartheid to take place. So how did the Dutch Reformed Church would eventually become condemned by the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and to figure out how that happened, we have to really look at the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. The Dutch Reformed Mission Church, I said, was under the parental guidance of the Dutch Reformed Church. And something really important to note is that that is in direct contradiction with Reformed Church polity. Reformed Church polity, based off of the Church Synod, the Church Order of Dort, Articles 84 and 85, say that no synod should be able to be controlled by another synod. Now here we have an entire denomination being controlled by another denomination. So it's completely against Dutch Reformed polity, or just Reformed Church polity in general. So we have that going on, and as the Dutch Reformed Mission Church develops more so in their own independence, They, in 1982, draft the Belhar Confession. They declare what is called a status confessionis, a state of confession, where they assert that the gospel of Jesus Christ is at stake based off of what the Dutch Reformed Church is doing and how the Dutch Reformed Church is operating. So they published this status confessionis, and the Belhar Confession is presented at the World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982. And the World Alliance of Reformed Churches backs up the Dutch Reformed Mission Church and says what the DRC is doing is wrong. It's heretical. It is heretical theology based on division rather than the eschatological unification that will come by Jesus Christ. So the Dutch Reformed Church is kicked out of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. And eventually in 1990, they would repent with the Rustenburg Declaration, but they still have not been brought back into fellowship with the other World Alliance of Reformed Churches members. So I want to close with one quote. Comes from J.J. F. Durand, and he's speaking of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church's relationship to the Dutch Reformed Church. It says, "This is the irony of Ottawa," which is where the Belhar Confession was presented. "In front of the World Forum of Reformed Believers, the DRC was condemned as the creator of an unbiblical and oppressive political apartheid by those who are both its product and its victims. Those very churches that the DRC frequently cited as evidence of the effectiveness and success of its missionary policy." So there you have it, everybody. Apartheid was a theological development that gave birth to a political policy, not the other way around. Thanks for listening.